Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Hannah Farber. Hannah is an assistant professor of history at Columbia University. She specializes in political economy of the colonial North America, the early American Republic, and the Atlantic world. Additional interests include modern globalization and the visual and material culture of ocean commerce. And today, we will speak about her book, Underwriters of the United States, How Insurance Shaped the American Founding. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I have to admit, Hannah, this is the first time I ever have a podcast about insurance, and I'm delighted about it, but also full of curiosity. I wonder how is it going to turn out. Uh, so let's start with the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How is it that you became interested in history, and then more precisely about insurances?
I was an undergraduate at Yale University when I fell in love with history. I had done some history before in high school, but what really compelled me about college level history and beyond was the idea that uh, my teachers didn't have all the answers yet. And when I realized that when I did history, what I could do was be a detective and solve my own little mysteries of the past and answer questions that were genuinely new, I was completely enthralled. So my first major piece of history was my undergraduate thesis at Yale, which was about conniving lawyers in colonial Maine in the 1600s. And my greatest ally in this project was a genealogist in Maine who was a woman in her 80s, and she drove me around Portland, Maine, which is a city balanced on the edge of icy cliffs. And as we rode around Portland in the dark in the icy cliffs with this very excited 80-year-old genealogist, I thought, boy, history is a lot more exciting to research than I ever imagined that it could be.
And do you live close to the sea? I mean, yeah, you just mentioned Maine, because the interest in ocean commerce has to come from somewhere.
Uh, the longer that you live in the United States as a historian, the more that you realize the ways that we live are still defined by the cities that were the first colonial port cities in the 1700s and the 1600s even. Uh, I live in Manhattan now, and you can't help noticing every day that New York City has a beautiful natural harbor and is on this incredible, beautiful waterway that determined so much about how life worked and where people lived for hundreds of years.
Okay, well, now here's the part that mystifies me. Why is it that you became interested in insurance?
That was mystifying to me too, and I think to my dissertation advisors at first. When I went to graduate school, I was looking for tales of adventure on the high seas. I was really captivated by the idea of the early United States as a place of wild opportunity, as a place where nothing was yet certain about how politics or economy or society would work, a place of tremendous cruelty, but also tremendous potential and uncertainty. And when I started reading stories about commercial voyages in the early US Republic shortly after the Revolution, I was at first just bemused to find how many references to insurance there were in the paperwork that I was tracing. And I found that really on the underneath side of every adventure story, there was a story about insurance, because American merchants were not foolish, and they were occupying a world in which commercial voyages offered enormous opportunity to them, particularly once the French Revolutionary Wars began and the world's greatest empires were at each other's throats. This offered enormous opportunities for Americans who had a really outsized commercial fleet of ships that they could use to get stuff to place to place. But it was a world occupied by privateers and warships, and it was very risky for them. So there had been insurance brokerages in America before the Revolution, but after the French Revolutionary Wars began, a wave of incorporations began, and insurance became a really extraordinarily high value American business because it was a way for merchants to organize their risks, to collectively buffer themselves against the risks of trading in this high risk world and take advantage of the immense opportunities that would come when, for example, you manage to get a ship full of ammunition or foodstuffs or high value produce like sugar past a blockaded port. You could then make a great deal of money. So while merchants tended to wring their hands and complain and worry constantly about their fate during the Age of Revolution, many of them were also actually making a lot of money very quietly, and their insurers, who tended to be expert merchants themselves, were also in a position to make a lot of money.
I wonder if you could go a bit farther back. I got from your book that marine insurance started in Renaissance Italy. So I wonder about the birth of the insurance industry as a whole. Who took that risk? Why? What was the profit margin or the profit possibility? What were the merchant routes at that time, and why was it so dangerous or lack of danger?
So it's not a coincidence that insurance in its modern form emerges in Renaissance Italy, because this is a world of city-states. It's a world of small political powers, not big ones. Rome has fallen, Europe is divided, and merchants need to find ways to make deals with one another over long stretches of land and water. They need contracts that are supple and effective and that allow them to do business with each other, and they need ways to buffer their risks. Traditionally, marine insurers have been expert merchants themselves, almost always. And the reason is that insurance is an incredibly complicated business because one does not know what will befall a merchant voyage once it begins. There are all kinds of peculiar circumstances that an insurer will have to evaluate to decide whether to honor a merchant's claim or not. So the only people really who have been able to handle this business since Renaissance Italy were people who are expert merchants themselves. And again, since the medieval period, the language of an insurance policy has essentially reflected this, suggesting that the insurer, the underlying belief of the insurance business was that an insurer needed to act as if he himself were on the voyage. So the merchant is actually not obligated to tell his insurer things that the insurer is already expected to know. In other words, there's an enormous body of customary knowledge that's built into the insurance business to negotiate this world of splintered political authority. And if the insurer does not know, for example, that the merchant is bribing a port official that you're not supposed to bribe, or is taking a particularly dangerous route through the Caribbean, that's not the merchant's fault. That's the insurer's problem to figure out. On the other hand, insurers also have authority over the merchants they insure, because they can always say, you did not follow our customary rules. You broke not only the laws that we always break, but you also broke the laws that we're not supposed to break. And for this reason, we're not honoring your policy. Or if you didn't follow the proper rules of commerce and your paperwork is not in order, we do not have to honor your policy. So in a way, through this splintered political period, merchants are governing themselves through the practice of insurance. The interesting part of the story to me then is when a new country comes into existence, the United States. It's contending with an old and organized business that has tremendous authority over the commerce that the United States needs to function. The United States, as I said, comes into being in a fragmented world. It comes into being in debt to its foreign funders. The United States is dependent on customs revenue, so it needs trade to function, or there's no money to fund the federal government. So the new United States government has to look to merchants and insurers and do a sort of a political dance with them to make sure that commerce keeps going, but also to make sure that they, as the government, is still in charge of making the laws of the country.
Yeah, just to highlight, at the beginning of the United States, there was no income tax as we know it today, and they financed themselves by imports and exports, I guess, in a
Yes.
way.
Yeah, 90% of the federal government's revenue is typically from import taxes until the 20th century. So there are tremendous political stakes to the control of the business of commerce. And when the federal government comes into existence, it has been given the constitutional right, the constitutional authority to manage uh, the international commerce of the United States, but it has no infrastructure, it has no information. So it's tremendously dependent on insurers who have this existing infrastructure for the aggregation of commercial news. So how many ships have been captured, where and when. Insurers have the latest news from the courts of Europe, where they can report things like, well, the British judges are deciding that this is an illegal voyage and this one is a legal voyage, or they're saying that they're getting reports from their ship captains that Napoleon's naval vessels are being particularly rapacious in the Caribbean this month. It's insurers who have aggregated this information, and the United States government needs it. Not only that, there's a tremendous force that insurers can have on public opinion by publishing insurance rates. This is true for the British, this is true for the French, this is true for the Americans. When news gets out during the American Revolution that American privateers have done such a good job preying on British merchant ships that the insurance costs for merchants buying insurance at Lloyd's of London has gone up, the Americans say, yay, they have no prayer, of course, they're not going to invade Britain. They have virtually no navy. So their metric of success in the American Revolution in naval terms is how much they can embarrass Britain and annoy British merchants and humiliate British politicians by causing insurance rates to go up. So American newspapers are very interested in when insurance rates are going up during wartime.
And before the American insurance companies were established, I guess the Americans used to insure all their shipments through English companies. And in addition to that, I guess the American insurance model was also copied from the British insurance model.
Excuse me. Yes, so there are American insurance brokerages in the colonial period, but they are not numerous and they're not large. They tend to multiply during wartime. American colonies are not generally permitted to incorporate joint stock insurance companies because these are seen as somewhat politically threatening. So Americans in the colonial period would tend to get insured in London or the British outports like Liverpool, or in other commercial cities like Bordeaux or Amsterdam or Hamburg, where where there are active insurance markets. Yeah.
And what was the main commodity or product that sailors used to insure at that time?
Absolutely everything, and the vessels themselves. Some goods were perishable, and they were quite sophisticated about the insurance of perishable goods. There was basically a higher deductible if you were shipping perishable goods like sugar or wheat. But you can also insure manufactured goods. You can insure the ships themselves. Often merchants would only insure cargo going one way. They might say their outgoing cargo is not worth insuring, but their cargo back is more valuable and they want to insure that. You can also insure the freight, which is the expenditures you had to make to simply run the voyage, sailor salaries and things like that. So ship, cargo, and freight are the main categories, and merchants can pick and choose what they want to insure from among those categories.
You just mentioned that sugar was perishable.
Yes.
I don't understand. I have a bag of sugar for a year in my cupboard.
Yes, your bag of sugar, which is industrially processed
I
white,
see.
perfectly dry sugar, I'm guessing that you also don't have a lot of rats in your house.
Right, right.
But if you are on a ship that might spring a leak, your sugar might get salty. Sugar crosses the ocean in various degrees of processing, so it could be very molassesy and lumpy. It might dissolve, and
Mm,
if you don't have a competent ship's cat on board, then you are at particular danger of loss to rats. And
mm.
believe it or not, there were insurance policies in which, and there were insurance cases in which the presence of a competent cat was disputed in court.
Wow. Okay. Uh, how did insurance decide to underwrite illegal cargoes, let's say weapons?
How did they decide whether to underwrite cargoes?
Yeah, I
That
know
was subject.
illegal cargoes, illegal
Illegal
merchandise.
cargoes?
Yeah.
Well, it's they preferred gray areas. And it was often a gray area during the age of revolution, whether you were shipping goods that were contraband of war or not. You could also finesse who it was who was actually the owner of the insured goods. So everybody is rather unclear on the precise rules of what counts as contraband of war. Different countries make declarations about what is or what isn't illegal commerce that, of course, best suits their own geopolitical positioning and their own military needs at that particular moment. So in a world without a single international governing authority, uh, it is this really old, experienced, established network of information gatherers who also have the ability to hire very good lawyers, the insurers, who are effectively making a lot of the decisions for American merchants about what is, shall we say, legal enough to attempt. And if foreign governments do not believe the arguments that American merchants are making about whether the goods they're shipping are legal or not, then sometimes the insurers will support the merchants in foreign courts, where they make the argument that in fact these goods belong to such and such a person, or that they were not bound to an enemy for the purpose of supporting their war efforts. And sometimes insurers win in court. But fundamentally, it is the insurer's own infrastructure of shared political and commercial information that makes them such powerful actors in this system. And so once American insurance companies began to multiply in the 1790s, uh, they become the authorities that merchants look to, both to determine what sort of voyages they want to attempt in these legal gray areas, and after their ships sometimes get caught and their goods confiscated, their insurance companies can guide them through the proceedings afterwards in court.
Right. When talking about history, I have learned not to impose our modern values of today to people of the past. And we were talking about trades. I wonder if the underwriters were also underwriting or financing the slave trade of the moment.
So they are very much underwriting the slave trade. Insurers are, in general, it is a high value business, the shipping of slaves. It's a risky business. So it is the perfect business for underwriters to come in on and charge high rates in the hopes that the voyages will go through and they will reap high profits. There is not a ton of American underwriting of slave voyages because the American slave trade is not very big after the founding of the United States. There are a few exceptions. There are a couple of port cities like Bristol, Rhode Island, and Charleston that are dominated by a few powerful slave traders who start sometimes their own insurance companies to support their slave trade. But it's generally understood that this international slave trade is probably on the way out for Americans after the ratification of the Constitution, again, with exceptions. But there is plenty of evidence that on a lower level, in more subtle ways, Americans are involved in underwriting foreign slave trading. And they do this using some of the techniques that they learned through their tricky commerce of contraband goods in the age of revolution. Those commercial networks that they have in place help them continue practices like false flagging, right, where you would sail your ship under a flag that doesn't really reflect its nationality, or you would engage in a sham sale of your vessel to a foreigner who was legally allowed to participate in the slave trade. And once the British Navy starts occupying itself more actively in trying to stamp out the slave trade, British naval vessels find commercial paperwork on American ships that proves that Americans are underwriting slave voyages. They do not tend to do it through corporations. And they're pretty quiet about why that's the case, but I think it's pretty obvious that corporations are institutions that have their own extensive paper trails. They're designed for the preservation of records. And if insurers are doing something that they know is legally questionable, they're going to want to do that on their own private books. Now, of course, they still have to put in writing, usually, what their deal is with the slaving captains. And that's what these British naval ships are uncovering. But I have found that the corporate history of American marine insurance is quite clean. Again, with a few exceptions, it's quite clean of the slave trade, but that does not mean that some of these same people who are corporate directors are not also underwriting the slave trade on their own books to a certain extent.
You mentioned that the underwriters of this insurance were experienced merchants, and obviously they have a significant amount of wealth since they were underwriting these voyages. I wonder how profitable was an insurance company at that time compared, like today, when I look at insurance, I don't see that as one of the biggest money-making industries of our present era, but I'm sure at that time it was a little bit different. How much money were investors getting out of their shareholdings of insurance companies?
So the way that I think about this has to do with the difference between sort of known unknowns, which some economists would identify formally as risks, and political uncertainties. And if you are only insuring against known risks across a very broad base of customers, say hurricanes or ship leakages, the vagaries of the weather, then insurance would tend to be a lower risk, lower reward business. And that would attract a certain kind of investor. And some of those companies do exist. Particularly as the 19th century goes on, there is a wing of the marine insurance business that is relatively stable and conservative. There is another wing of the marine insurance business. And what I argue in my book is that that's most of the marine insurance business during the age of revolution is made up of people who have a higher tolerance for risks, or rather we might say, who have a tolerance for underwriting uncertainties, the uncertainties of politics, the uncertainties of war, the things that really can't be calculated. They cannot be actuarially assessed. You cannot set an actuary to work determining what Napoleon is about to tell his navy to do in 2 weeks. It's simply unknowable. It's a human, political, one-time circumstance. And that type of insurance attracts a different kind of investor, someone who is interested in the high risk, high reward climate. So it's hard to sum up how much these folks make over time, because their profits and the profits of these early American insurance companies can be very high, but they're also quite unpredictable. What I find is that in aggregate, insurance companies in the United States make a huge amount of money during the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. So from the 1790s really through the War of 1812, when Britain finally gets fed up with the United States, turns the whole Navy on the US, and the musical chairs a little bit come to a stop for the Americans. Though again, not so much as you would think. You can always find underwriters who are interested in this high risk, high reward climate, because you can charge a merchant a 70% premium if that merchant thinks he's going to make 500% if his ship comes in. Nothing is out of the question. So early American insurance companies have wild but unpredictable profits through this period. If you invest early in one of these companies, you're quite lucky. You are making, on average, I think, more money than you would make investing in American banks, which are founded by some of the same people, but which are mostly lending to merchants and which manage to issue lower but more regular returns. The insurance company is a more Wild West frame of investment at that time. It's not how insurers like to portray themselves. And one of the things that I talk about at the end of the book is the ways in which everybody likes to forget the ways in which insurance companies function as risk takers. They literally are risk takers, but they have to convince you that they're stable. And one of the things that made it easy for us to forget this history is that one of the biggest bets the early marine insurance industry makes is a bet on the United States itself. And I talk in my book about how insurance companies invest their funds in federal securities, the ways in which they're betting on the success of American merchant commerce as a whole. Remember, most insurers are merchants themselves, so they're in on the United States. They're going to engage in business in the legal gray areas, nonetheless, when they think it's going to make them a profit. But they don't like to be seen as reckless, risk-taking organizations. And by the mid-19th century, when Americans are starting to really celebrate the history of their founding period, the story of this group of wily but committed early American investors just doesn't code for people with the Revolutionary period. It's not military heroism, it's not naval heroism. It's people who are genuinely in it, but they're in it because they're making an informed bet that the United States is going to succeed as a state, and that their investments in American commerce, in the American government, in American banks are going to pay off. They succeed, these investments pay off, but it's not a story that makes sense to most Americans, which is how it's been so widely forgotten.
Today, when someone buys an insurance, those insurance premiums have been calculated by actuaries, by statistics, computer models, so on and so forth. At that time, being that most of the underwriters were merchants, I mean, it doesn't come to my mind that they had sophisticated mathematical models to figure out what was the premium of certain cargo. I wonder, how did they compute how much they were going to charge for a particular voyage?
Right. So early American marine insurers have a tremendous amount of expertise that goes into deciding the proper premium for a voyage, but it is not mathematical. As I mentioned, their business is a business of political uncertainty layered over a business of maritime risk. You do not find actuarial tables or calculations from this period. You find merchants who have decades of experience in the lines of ocean commerce that they underwrite. And they also are obsessive readers of the news. Every time an insurance company is founded, they subscribe to 5 or 10 newspapers to make sure they're up to date. They also have active networks of private correspondents who are telling them what's going on in the oceans and overseas. So they insure through their horse sense that they developed through long experience with this climate. And they acknowledge that some of these risks really are unknowable. And so you do see, when you track rates over time during the age of revolutions, that sometimes there's an enormous spike of in insurance rates for a route where there's been recent captures, disasters, some political proclamation that something is off limits, and then you'll find the rates settle down again as merchants figure out their workarounds.
Right. Okay. One more question. At that time, different colonies have different currencies, and I wonder, how did they deal with all this? I mean, let's say an insurance company in Boston, how would they figure out the currency to charge a merchant in another colony?
So American underwriters are generally underwriting other American ventures. the world of American currency, money, and finance in this period is so wildly and insanely complex. You'd have to do 10 more episodes of your podcast to deal with it. But what I would emphasize actually is that their unit account shifts from the pound to the dollar gradually in the 1790s. But again, merchants are doing business with each other, not just according to the rules of the United States, but to customs of merchant practice that they understand as as timeless and transnational. So insurance companies are actually effectively doing lending to their merchant customers. It is not expected that a merchant pays for his policy until his ship comes in.
Mm.
And there are times given in the policy for how much time the merchant's supposed to have to pay. But the idea is that you don't have to pony up in whatever chaotic kind of currency you might be dealing with, because your ship is going to come in literally, and then you'll settle up with the company. And some merchants choose to let their books ride with the company for extended periods of time. Increasingly, as the United States becomes banked, merchants and insurance companies both have accounts with local banks, and they manage the transactions there, which are increasingly and pretty swiftly so denominated in dollars. But a lot of this business, the insurance business, as I said, is crypto banking, and it's designed so that money doesn't have to change hands. And I think that's another reason why people don't necessarily understand the scale of the transactions that are happening between merchants and their insurers during this period, because so much of it happens just quietly on the books of the insurance companies.
Right. Today, when two nations do trading, let's say two nations are buying and selling oil, they do that within the US dollars as a point of reference. At that time, was it the British pound that they used as a reference, or did they use something else as a reference?
It's worse than that. There is, during the colonial period, Americans do business with one another according to a pound that's actually less valuable than the British pound sterling. And the value of that pound changes over time, and it's different between different colonies in America. Not only that, so that's the unit account, but then they might actually be paying one another in Spanish silver, in gold, which may or may not be, reliable in the amount of the pure metal that they wanted to have. They're often doing business in part in legally binding IOUs, which they just pass around to one another. Some of the American colonies issue different kinds of currency, paper currency, which devalues at different rates at different times. It's honestly a miracle to me that any business managed to happen at all, but it just goes to show you what people are capable of doing when money is on the line.
Wow. Well, Hannah, somehow you managed to transform what it seems to be a boring subject, which is insurance, into a fascinating subject full of history. And it's just the power underneath the movement of commerce and revolutions that propelled the United States to be the nation that it is. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me. Underwriters of the United States: How Insurance Shaped the American Founding. My swashbuckling history of early American insurance is available at UNC Press or booksellers everywhere.
And where can we follow you?
I am a professor at Columbia University. You can send your children to my classes and they'll report back to you everything that they need to know about the early American Republic, early American commerce. I also teach about autobiography and early American law and other fun aspects of life in the early United States.
Hannah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.